Okay, so I haven't moved the camera from where I was because I'm just continuing on with rationalism and how is it that we were looking at it by way of the Velasquez. So what I'm doing now is covering some more parts that I had you look at, having to do with how rationalism is structured philosophically by way of Plato and Socrates, and then also a little bit of Leibniz, and then also a little bit on Jainism. So, right off the top, we already have looked at some bits of Descartes, and so Descartes is rationalist, and then likewise, I had you look at some points on Spinoza as well, in order to get a better picture of how it is that we're understanding rationalism. So I'm going to let the train. Oh, there we go. Okay, so first let's cover this idea, this notion of innate ideas. So this one's relatively straightforward. So in other words, we are born with an innate capacity for reason, and that's what we were referring to with Descartes, where we were proposing that human beings have maybe a good way to think about it is a type of software, otherwise known as reason, by which we organize our thinking and our knowledge. So I always propose reason to be a structuring mechanism by which we're understanding laws and principles of thought, by which we recognize as innate or natural to humans. Okay, so in other words, some of these ways of thinking about reason are that we think of it as the example of a shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Equal numbers added to equal numbers result with the results being equal. We could even just think of single concepts like a point, or what a line is, or what straight means, or what equality is, what is an event, what is a cause. So even when we just think of a straight line, we could think of just the idea that something that is not crooked, something that contradicts a straight line would be a crooked line, so to speak. So even when we were thinking of the Aristotle's P and C, that's a rationalist principle. But with innate ideas, we were brought to the interesting story that's highlighted, Velasquez highlights from Plato's Meno. So know that Plato and Socrates are idealist and also rationalist. And so all the way that they're going to angle our understanding of epistemology, in other words, the way that we acquire knowledge, is rationally, okay? And so we have the example, the anecdote from Plato's Meno, whereby we have the doubling of the square. So we have the little lesson whereby the slave boy is asked to double the size of a square. And so when the boy tries to double the size of the square, he actually quadruples the size of the square by drawing key lines that actually increase this so that it's not double the size, but rather 4 times the size. So then Socrates shows him, well, if you simply draw the lines so that you have this way of working that is diagonal from your original square here, so you have this way of drawing it out geometrically. This way of drawing it out geometrically is actually the doubling of this square. So this is double the area geometrically. And so when Socrates shows the slave boy this drawing, the slave boy has the aha moment, where that aha moment is then a recognition that, I understand how it is that this is double the size of the square, and then also how this is understood geometrically, right? So how this is understood geometrically is understood by the slave boy rationally. So his aha moment is a recognition of his own rational capacity to understand geometry. Okay, so maybe that's a good way of putting it. So it's not just the aha moment, it's rather the aha moment is such where it's like, now I know that I'm keying into what is rational. And so that keying into what is rational is proposed by Plato and Socrates to be something that is recalled to us from a past life. So, and that past life is how it is that we were taking part in the eternal and the ideal, not only the eternal and the ideal, but more generally speaking, the rational. Okay, so in other words, our rational selves are eternal and not individual. And what we're doing when we're recognizing our own rational nature is we're keying into that. So the word for keying into that is anamnesis. So that recollection of the time before you were born, and to key into what is rational is otherwise known as anamnesis. Okay? And so what that's showing us is that we already have the capacity to understand mathematics, logic, reason from the past, from our eternal past before we were born, for Plato and Socrates, okay? Then, so moving from the Meno, Plato and Socrates to Leibniz, who was born in 1642, 1716, then we are also having a kind of correction, if you will, whereby Leibniz is proposing that, number one, we do think rationally, and we must understand everything rationally, because Leibniz also was a rationalist. But we don't have these ideas in our head as soon as we're born. In other words, babies don't step out of the womb already knowing how to do geometry, okay? So in other words, ideas are not just fully formed in our own minds at birth, rather they are tendencies or dispositions. So in other words, the example of the statue of Hercules within the marble is given, whereby the marble's disposition is such that it has the ability to take on the statue of Hercules by way of being carved by the sculptor, but it does not have that design within it already. So in other words, it doesn't have the specific ability or specific plan for the statue already in it. It just has the tendency or the disposition, if you will, just like we do as human beings, to do math. So in other words, we have the capacity to do math. We don't automatically know how to do math, right? So that's where we get this idea that we already assume that someone can add, we just need to teach them how to do it, right? We already know that someone can do geometry, or someone can count or do multiplication. They just need to know the specifics of how to do those operations, to do those mathematical operations. And when they are taught those specifics, then what's taken as an assumption is their rational capacity, their rational disposition to be rational, okay? So that's Leibniz's view. And then Velasquez also brings in the religion of Jainism, which is from ancient India prior to Christianity. Mahatma Gandhi was a Jain, and this is the idea whereby we're thinking that we already hold complete knowledge as we're born. So This is going back very similar to something that looks like what Plato and Socrates are thinking of, but yet we are not limited to time and space, but yet our knowledge is understood in everything. So in other words, the way in which we understand things is present in everything. So in other words, when you look out to the world, you're understanding your own thinking as well. And you're understanding that way in which everything appears as contributing to a complete knowledge of everything, okay? And so, in other words, we are looking at this way of working to purify our vision of knowledge so that we could gain access to it, but yet that access is obscured by our impure, unethical actions. So our unethical actions are generally thought of as our selfish actions. So our selfish actions are what distract us from ahimsa. So ahimsa is otherwise known as non-violence. So that's what is made famous by Gandhi, who Martin Luther King was inspired by to have his non-violent civil rights actions, etc. And so non-violence is contributing to a cooperation that we have within a whole in order to emphasize this idea that we are all working together. So this idea that we are working together is the higher knowledge that we want to work with and understand as far as a Jain is angled, wants to angle our thinking. So getting away from the animal urges that are selfish to recognize a transcendence of violence in the name of self-interest, to then recognize the whole as cooperative. So in other words, in order to start working with the whole, we have to start letting go of that which obscures that to be things like selfishness, and selfishness that leads to violence, that hinder our cooperation and our interaction with the whole of knowledge, so that we could start then understanding ourselves better, right? So taking care of yourself, yet in other words, there's a stress on, yet the answer is yes, we should take care of ourselves, but always know that this begins with letting go of this notion that your self-interest comes above others' self-interests, not only in terms of human beings, but also in terms of our planet as well, right? That the whole world is my family is a way that a Jain is wanting to get us to understand. And the only way that we're going to get to recognize that in practice is by getting away from violence, right? So non-violence is ahimsa, which promotes unity. This is metaphysical, and likewise, this is known by reason. Okay, so the Jain is also getting us to be more rational and understand our rational capacity by way of this working with ahimsa. Okay, so I think that's it, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.